who we were, and who we're destined to become are all reflections of the stories we tell, of gods and devils from tales of the heart to those of fear and foreboding. Stories shape us in the world we live in. Myths, folk tales, and even religious parables all define our cultures and beliefs. In each episode of Faith and Fear, we will dip our toes into the comparative narratives spanning the globe, considering the concepts and archetypes common to us all. And Le Shalom and Prazir. Hello and peace. It's a pleasure. Thanks for following me down the rabbit hole once again, and my journey to better understand the stories and beliefs that shape us. We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. Ted Bundy. I'm pretty excited about this week's episode, which was originally scheduled for Halloween weekend, but sometimes life has its own plans, and things come up. Still, I'm glad to finally bring you our discussion on true crime narratives, and why we are so infatuated with them, especially when it comes to serial killers. To do that, I've brought you a very special guest, Kate Wallinga of Ignorance Was Bliss, a podcast about who we are. Kate is an amazing host and storyteller, with an impressive professional history to match. But I'll let her tell you herself. Without further ado, I bring you True Crime Narratives with Kate Wallinga. I would like to introduce you all to the amazing Kate Wallinga. Kate, thanks for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
I am as sane as I ever get, so I guess that's pretty good.
I think we can all say that. Well, I hope we can all say that.
It's the goal. You know what I mean?
That's exactly, there you go.
The goal.
That's a great way to put it. So there's a reason I really wanted to do this episode with you. Could you tell everyone a bit about your background?
Sure. So way back when I actually started off studying engineering, and I'm pretty good with it. I'm good with technology, that kind of idea, but I don't like it. I don't find it interesting to me because it's so predictable. It's supposed to be predictable. You want bridges to be predictable. That's an excellent trait for a bridge or a building, is to know that it's going to continue standing, right?
Right.
And that's fine, but that's not for me. Like, for me, I like the fact that I'm going to ask a question and I don't necessarily know where you're going to go when I ask that question. And I wasn't sure psychology was the right answer. I just knew that it wasn't necessarily going to be engineering. And I got sick my junior year of college, and somebody brought me, while I was in the hospital, somebody brought me the book Mindhunter before it was a Netflix series. And I thought, I could do that. That's fascinating. That's unpredictable. I sure hope it's unpredictable. I'm going to do that. And ultimately, I backed it off a bit, and I decided I didn't want to be in law enforcement. For many reasons. I didn't want to carry a gun. I didn't want to travel as much as you were going to have to travel to do that job. And profiling bothers me in many ways. There's a lot of assumption and a lot of,
I can see that.
a lot of dehumanization
Right.
in it. And I wanted instead to sit down with the people that had done the things, and I wanted to find their humanity and figure out what brought you to this place. Because the vast majority of people who are in prison or in a locked psychiatric facility, they didn't wake up that morning and say, I'm going to go commit a crime and this is where I want to end up today. Instead, it's a combination of bad luck and heightened emotion and split-second decision-making that lands you left instead of right. And things go badly. And I wanted to know more about that. I wanted to understand that more. And so I worked as a forensic psychologist, which just means a psychologist that is involved in the criminal justice system. I also did crisis work. So if somebody shows up in the emergency room with suicidal or homicidal thoughts or psychotic or manic episodes, those sorts of things, I would kind of talk to them and figure out, like, where are you at and what needs to happen next. And I got to do that for a little over a decade. And then I broke my back, which is not ideal at all. And I spent a couple of years home recovering. And when I was able to start feeling a little more functional again, I was still on permanent disability. And so I was like, well, what can I do to use this information that I have and these opinions that I have and these experiences that I've had, but in a more fun way? I mean, fun being a subjective term, I know, but I was like, people are interested in this. Let's talk about that. And so I started
I understand
a podcast.
What you're saying. Right.
And so I started Ignorance Was Bliss in February of 2018. And the idea was that if you can understand what it is like to start a podcast or to be a parent or to have depression, things like that, then you can understand what it is like to break a law or to experience schizophrenia or to be a serial killer. And that has been my goal, is to collect stories, not fictional stories, but actual experiences, to help people seem more relatable and understandable.
Similarly to my podcast's ultimate goal is to garner understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I brought you here tonight to talk a bit about true crime narratives. Basically what you said, why people enjoy the genre, hearing these stories, and even have an infatuation with serial killers. I myself have only gotten into true crime over the last few years, but in a short time, it's very much grabbed my attention. Things people are capable of, their motivations and lack thereof, are both incredibly terrifying. Real life truly can be stranger than fiction. I first wanted to define true crime for those who don't know. In the simplest words, true crime is a nonfiction genre that focuses on actual crimes and the people who commit them, examining both the backstory behind these incidents as well as their consequences. Historically speaking, it's my understanding that the genre actually dates back to the 16th century, when a surprisingly large number of stories regarding capital crimes were reported by British printers. This was during a time when print technology was evolving and more people were beginning to read. Crime pamphlets, often describing horrendous murders, were produced, sometimes even accompanied by gruesome woodcut illustrations. But of course, that was only the beginning. Now, people consume stories about murder, domestic violence, crimes of passion, specifically female criminals, and especially heinous serial killers at an alarming rate. I find our obsession with these narratives just as fascinating as some of the crimes themselves. So, Kate, from the perspective of someone in your profession, why do you think there's such an interest in this genre and these types of violent cases?
Those are two very different questions, I think. Actually, that there's an interest, I think, in true crime there for a lot of reasons. I would argue that it depends on the person, that there are people. I would boil it down, I guess, to the simplest explanation I can give is that we like to otherize. We like to distance ourselves from the concept of violence and pain. We want to pretend that people who commit crimes are fundamentally different and flawed and evil, and that if we can just pinpoint what that is, we can point at it and we can see it and identify it and tell ourselves, I'm safe because I'm not those things, and so I won't commit a crime. And we also want to otherize and distance ourselves from victims. We want to say that the victim was either pure as the driven snow or that they put themselves in harm's way. And that either therefore they had this like unattainable perfection and purity almost to who they are. So that's not me, so nobody's going to want to attack me, right? So there are people who focus very much on what we call the innocent victim. And to me, what that does is take away a lot of the personality of the victim and
Right.
just call them they're perfect. Nobody wants to be perfect. Perfect is both boring and unattainable. Or we talk about, well, she kind of asked for it by what she was wearing. Was she drinking? Those
Victim
sorts of
blaming.
questions. Right. And in either way, so either they are unattainably perfect and that keeps me safe, or they do these dangerous things. They use substances, or they engage in sex work, or a number of other factors that somehow allow us to say, well, see, I'm never going to be the target of a crime because I'm not those things either. So either way, we try to do what we can to separate ourselves out, and we pretend that we are safe. We pretend that we have control that we don't actually have. So I think that's why we're interested in the genre, in the concept of crime. It's this idea that if we can just wrap our arms and our brain around what leads to the big bad thing, then we can distill it down to its most basic avoidable concept. And we want to do that because then we can pretend we're safe.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then on the other question that you asked is sort of, you didn't word it this way, but basically the question is, what the heck is hybristophilia? Which is the fancy name for why are, and I'm going to use gender stereotypes here because it tends somewhat to lean in this direction, although gender really doesn't have anything to do with it. But why are good girls drawn to bad boys? Why do serial killers have groupies? Why do people write letters to serial killers and collect pictures or artwork or autographs or that sort of thing? What is that about? And that's a whole different mess of stuff that has nothing to do with the true crime so much as it does with the how close can I get to this fire, this flame without getting burned.
Right, that makes sense. My immediate thoughts are that it comes down to not only curiosity, but a need to understand. We want to know what people are capable of, but I think there's also a need to understand the motivations behind these crimes, like you were saying, and how these things can turn out the way they do. I actually came across an article on mentalfloss.com giving a list of 12 reasons why we love true crime, and I thought it was actually interesting. So according to the author, it's because being interested in, even obsessed with such narratives is normal, because evil fascinates us. And as I mentioned before, we want to know why people do these things. It's because of the media and the 24/7 news cycle bombarding us with these stories. Because frankly, it's difficult for us to look away from a train wreck or a spectacle. It's because sometimes they help educate us and make us feel more prepared. It's because, evolutionarily speaking, we've learned to look for signs of anything that can harm us, so we pay extra attention to these narratives. Sometimes it's because, as you were saying, Kate, we're glad we're not the victim. And other times, because we're glad we're not the perpetrator. Then there's the chemical biological response. These stories give us a safe adrenaline rush. Sometimes it's the mystery and our love for puzzle solving. Some of us like being scared, especially in a controlled situation. We find these stories intriguing, captivating, even comforting. I thought it was a very interesting list, but hearing your thoughts on it, it kind of seems a little narrow-minded.
Well, I disagree with some of it, and that's fine that I do, because it's at the end of the day just one woman's opinion, you know? But for instance, I don't think most people are interested in understanding. I think they're interested in labeling. And as well, we as a society don't understand violent behavior at all. Because the only violent offenders that we have had the opportunity to study in any sort of depth are the failures, the ones that got caught. So we don't know how many are actually out there and still functioning and still doing their thing. You know, for instance, there are some myths, and they are outright myths, such as there's something called the McDonald Triad, which says that serial killers engaged in cruelty to animals, bedwetting, and fire setting. Complete myth.
Right, I've heard that before.
It's entirely a commonality among many serial killers who were interviewed in the 1980s who had been caught. But we don't have any idea whether, you know, we don't have any idea how many people did those three things and never engaged in serial killing. And we don't have any idea how many people are still out there functioning as serial killers and what traits they do and don't have, because we don't catch them.
It's become my understanding that those three signs are actually considered to be more so a sign of abuse these days than signs of a potential serial killer.
They're at least signs of distress.
Right.
I wouldn't even go so far as necessarily to label it abuse, because I don't know. Because there are kids who are abused who behave in those ways, and there are kids who are abused who don't. And so
Absolutely.
this idea of being able to pick out very specific identifiable factors, another legend, myth in the true crime genre, is the idea that if someone has been active as a predator of some sort, whether that means a serial killer or a serial rapist or whatever it might be, if someone is repeatedly violent toward other people and then they stop, we tell ourselves they either died or they're in jail, because they'll never stop. They'll only increase in violence and increase in frequency. That's a story we tell ourselves. It's not accurate. That's just something that many of the people who have been interviewed have said. But we also know of some pretty famous cases of people who just went dormant, who just changed their behaviors because they changed their behaviors, because they were always making a choice. They were never compelled to behave violently. They just opted to stop for one reason or another. It stopped being in their best interest to behave in this predatory way, and so they decided, I'm not going to do this for a while. And then sometimes they switch back on again. So things like that, just, we think we have these truths because we hear them repeated over and over and over again, but that doesn't make them true. It just makes them commonly misunderstood.
That makes a lot of sense. I like to think that people want understanding, but like you said, the truth of the matter is that's usually not the case. We usually want to pigeonhole people into these very concise, narrow-minded categories that very rarely tells the whole story.
Right. No, very, very much so. An example that I give is, so I have master's degrees in mental health counseling and criminal justice, and then I went on and got my doctorate later. And my criminal justice master's thesis was on the use of sex offender registries and whether this is a good idea. And the short version is no. Terrible idea. They're not helpful. They shouldn't be accessible to the public. They do not decrease danger, and they do not help identify likely perpetrators in any way. That the reality is sex offenders actually have the lowest recidivism rates among classes of criminals, because often the sex offense is a matter of, I didn't know that was illegal, or I was using at the time and I've stopped using, and so now I have more self-control, or I've learned that I don't actually want to experience prison again, and so I'm going to change my behaviors, not because of a special concern about society or safety of others, but about looking out for themselves. And honestly, at the end of the day, for me, I don't care why you behave better. I just care that you stop hurting people.
Exactly.
And so the concept of the sex offender registry, the concept that you can look up in your neighborhood, often not just how many adjudicated sex offenders live in your neighborhood, but you can find their names, what their charges are, and you can find their photos. I find that to be incredibly dangerous, both because it makes it that much harder for the offender to have completed their time and be reassimilated into society. And if we're not going to let them do that, then why do we let them out at all? And also it creates this false sense of safety. Like, so I have kids. A lot of my friends have kids. And a lot of my friends very carefully researched the town that they wanted to move to and the neighborhoods they were interested in, and looked up the sex offender registries and would say, I don't want to move to this neighborhood, or I do want to move to that neighborhood because of the relative rates of offenders in this particular neighborhood. And the answer to that is, that's incredibly stupid. All that is where they've moved after they were released from having served time, for one. And for two, anybody, any human, can think about, who do you feel strong enough emotion toward that you want to engage in some sort of sexual act with or violence with? People that you know, for the most part. We don't understand stranger crime because it's very, very, very unusual. It's very rare. We don't understand it. And those who enact it can't explain it because they don't understand themselves very well. The vast majority, and when I say vast, I mean like over 99% of offenders act out against people that are known to them. Your children are not in danger from strange Raymond who lives 5 houses up on the right and never turns his lights on at the right time of day. Your children are in danger from their teachers, their religious leaders, their caregivers, your relatives, your partner, the kids they play with on the playground, because those are the people that they see on the regular. Those are the people they interact with. Those are the people who develop the kind of emotion and the kind of attraction that's necessary for them to decide they want to follow through and act on it.
Well, just listening at some of these stories, and I really don't like using the term stories because story sounds like you're talking about something fiction, but just hearing some of these cases, majority of the time when these crimes are committed, the first person you look at when a spouse is dead, you look at the husband, or you look at the wife. And when a child is missing, you look at the parents. You look at see if the parents are going through a divorce or separation. You look at estranged family members. You look at the people that are known to the victim before you start looking at strangers. And yet it seems like we're constantly talking about. I heard a story that during the 90s, the program Stranger Danger actually did more harm to child abductions than anything else, because people weren't looking at their neighbors. They were expecting, somebody from outside of town or something to that extent as the most likely suspect, when it's usually, as you said, somebody the child is familiar with.
Right. And if there are cases, pretty high profile cases of child abduction and child murder and that sort of thing, where the parent or caregiver opted not to report immediately because they knew exactly where their child was and who they were with, and you just can't go to that place in your brain that says that this family friend or family member or Boy Scout leader or school teacher or whoever it may be, that you can't allow yourself to wrap your brain around the idea that that person might want to hurt my children or might already have hurt my children. So instead, they wouldn't report them missing in a quick window of time when they might have been rescued and protected.
It's actually pretty disturbing when you think about it, and just the idea that you have to be concerned with, people that you're supposed to trust, people that you're supposed to be able to rely on, and those are the ones that pose the most danger to you.
On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, to me, I said I have 4 kids, and I actually find that to be fairly reassuring, because if I stop and I think that I have to make the whole world safer to allow my kids to live in it safely, that's exhausting and overwhelming and impossible. You can't begin to do that. But I can create children that know it's always okay to go to mom or dad, that know it's always okay to tell, and if they can't say the words, they can write them down, or they can draw pictures, or they, teach kids how to communicate, how to express themselves. And, a common, I guess, weapon used by abusers is that they tell the child, don't tell anybody, they'll be mad at you, I'll hurt your family, that kind of thing. And so instead, I focus on, look, I'm not going to try to make the whole world safe. I'm going to try to make resilient kids who know how to express themselves and communicate, and who believe me when I say that the only thing you're ever going to get in trouble with me is if you lie to me. But if you come and tell me the truth about what is happening to you, or even if you don't know what is happening to you, but it's confusing or it feels unusual, or someone tells you not to tell me, you come and you tell me and we'll work it out. And it doesn't mean they're going to get in trouble, and it doesn't mean you're going to get in trouble, but that gives me a concrete and manageable set of steps that I can take to keep my kids safer.
That's a great way of looking at it. Because like you said, you can't control the whole world, but you can pay a little more attention to your immediate circle and the things that are going on around you. I don't know. I feel like these narratives give us a look into what people are truly capable of, the worst we have to offer, and an insight into the darkest parts of humanity, albeit a very tiny and minuscule one. But I also think perhaps that it gives us an insight into our own darker side, albeit from a safe, sometimes very privileged standpoint.
I mean, the phrase that I use for it is that it's tragedy porn.
Yeah, that's...
That we get drawn into this idea of, there's both a push-pull of being enticed by it and yet repelled by it at the same time. And that's all pretty normal and natural stuff. And, there are different people who will say like the 1970s were like the heyday of the American serial killer. That's not true. That's just when we paid more attention to them. And we interviewed them after they were found guilty sometime in the 70s. Then we interviewed them in the 80s. And that's when we learned about those ones. But that doesn't mean we actually learned anything. And as you're saying, back to the 16th century, and I would argue beyond that, like I believe that concepts like werewolves and vampires are based on serial offenders.
Absolutely. I've heard that theory before, and I've even heard, well, there's a number of serial killers and murderers who have been given aliases, like Elizabeth Bathory is a perfect example. She's, been viewed as a vampire because of her alleged penchant for killing numerous women and just bathing in their blood and doing horrendous things like that. So it's entirely possible that a lot of the monsters and creatures that, we were warned about in bedtime stories and fairy tales and whatnot were people that just had monstrous behaviors. I guess.
And arguably, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, she was called, she may not have done any of it. She may have been the victim of a political smear campaign. Like, it's hard to know, it all wraps around. We don't know what truth is because we as humans tend to get so invested in our perception of a reality that we can't let go of the fact that maybe we're wrong.
Right, especially because she was such a wealthy and powerful woman at that time, and a bunch of men, were around her and didn't like the fact that she had that amount of authority or that amount of money. It's entirely possible and plausible that they could have orchestrated this whole narrative to get rid of her, to get rid of whatever competition that she gave them.
And she might have been a violent person, or she might have learned that if she behaves in unpredictable and violent ways, that her political enemies are more likely to give her a little more space and a little more freedom to behave in other ways as she chose to. So, like, my point with her is not that I do or don't believe in the stories about her. It's that there's an example where we attribute this concept of evil and we don't look at it from like a sociopolitical lens, which that's how humans function. We always have.
Right.
Everything's got spin.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to go back to focusing a little bit on serial killers, if that's all right.
Sure.
I understand that you've treated a considerable range of criminality. Has that ever included serial killers? Would you mind telling us a little bit about that, whatever confidentiality will allow?
Sure. I have a couple of signed releases for names that people are familiar with, although I opt to keep their clinical diagnoses and practices off my podcast and out of media because I don't feel like that's my place. But for instance, I have met and worked with Pamela Smart, who was not a serial killer, but she had the movie To Die For with Nicole Kidman is based on her.
Right.
She was a very young 23, I think, year-old teacher in New Hampshire who convinced her 15-year-old boyfriend and his buddies to kill her husband because she didn't want a divorce, because if she got a divorce, she might not get custody of her dog. Like, that's how fundamentally skewed her decision-making abilities are, right? I've also worked and gotten to know a woman named Sheila Labar, who was another female serial killer in New Hampshire, who has 3 or 4 known, or at least their cases are closed, victims. She's in prison for 2 murders, but there's at least 2 more that we're pretty sure she did. And then since incarceration, they have found unidentified human remains on her property that they're not sure where she's from, but she's... There are some people who, like, it serves someone best if they want to enact serial crime. And when I say serial crime, I mean of any sort, whether you want to steal a lot of cars or kill a lot of people. When you want to do the same thing over and over again, the secret to success there is not to stand out, right? You don't want people to pay attention to you. And she is one who failed at that miserably. She gives off a unpleasant and aggressive aura. Just walking past her on the rec yard would make me uncomfortable. That she didn't seem angry or violent toward any one person. She just had an edgy, dark feeling about her. Being in the room with her was uncomfortable. There are more... I've worked with more male serial offenders that I can't name, but whether they are, as I said, serial thieves, serial rapists, serial murderers, I've worked with a number of them.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Those who have committed a lot of these types of crimes, especially the serial crimes, have earned a growing level of celebrity these last few decades. Charles Manson, Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Richard Ramirez, and so many others have inspired not only fictional stories and characters, but real-life fan bases, even copycats. My question is, why? I know there's no simple answer, but why is there this specific attraction to the types of people most would consider evil? I know you touched on that a little bit previously.
Yeah, there's 2 sides of it. There's the why are people drawn to it, and like I said, there's a sort of a fascination by that which we think we could never do, and we want to see how close can we hold our hands to the open flame before we get burned. And there's a certain degree of either belief in the ability to tame the evil, bad person, or a belief that this is the best I would possibly ever deserve. That I don't deserve somebody who's living, a straight life on the streets. And there's also a certain control aspect. If you start a relationship, whatever relationship might mean to you, with somebody who's in prison, you know where he's sleeping at night. So there's a certain backwards comfort to that. As well, among and between any group of people, podcasters, teachers, serial killers, there is awareness of those with shared interests, and there's competition. So teachers want their classes to have the highest overall grade point average. Podcasters want to make the best podcast they can, whether that means the most listener engagement, or the highest downloads, or the longest run time, whatever that may mean. Serial killers want to rack up the highest victim count, or they want to get better at what they do in terms of not getting caught and pursuing what they consider to be the perfect crime. And I mean, in a twisted way, it's their art. It's their calling in life, and they want to do it to the best of their ability. And so they study each other, and they correspond with each other, and they trade notes.
That makes a lot of sense. Of course, there's the spectacle of it, and I know there's a level of entertainment value that comes with far too high a price. And of course, a lot of these people are considered real life boogeymen whose acts of cruelty scream to be seen and heard. But similarly to, as you were saying, why you chose the route that you chose, after listening to a lot of these stories, I've learned that despite most of these individuals' horrific acts, they are human, and they each have a story, often backgrounds nearly as horrendous as the crimes they've committed. Not always, but very often. And sometimes it's hard to not empathize with the things that they've been through.
Well, and I think we should empathize with them. I think, I'm not saying forgive them or excuse them.
Right.
They should be held accountable for the decisions that they make. But if we don't have empathy for people, then we're never going to stop or impact violence as a cultural icon.
And like you said, they didn't start out as monsters.
No, they didn't. And I mean, I think a story that I've told before on my own show is when I first started I worked primarily in a men's prison in New Hampshire, and because there were many more male prisoners than there were women, and so I only occasionally went to the women's facility, and I spent most of my time in the men's facility. And when I first started, I was asked just to do sort of intake paperwork of a sort. You kind of want to swoop in and get as much background as you can before they've had a ton of time to talk to the other people on the rec yard or their cellmates or the like, to hopefully get a little bit more honesty. For instance, have you ever been diagnosed with ADHD? After a little while, and a very little while, they learn that the answer that they, visual quotes, should be giving is, oh yeah, no, I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 3 years old, and I am on the maximum human dosage of Adderall. I've been on Adderall forever, and I need more of that right now, please, thank you. Because Adderall has high value within prison, just like it does on the street, right? It's meth. And if you catch them early enough, and you catch them in a non-intimidating, non-adversarial kind of mindset, they're a little bit more likely to be honest with you about it and say, like, no, I was never diagnosed with that. Or if they say they were, then you set up the testing to do so. And so that was my sort of first task that I was allowed to do without being supervised the whole time.
Right.
And one of the guys that they started me off with was just an incredibly intimidating physical specimen. Just like had to sort of literally duck and turn a little bit to walk through your average doorway, because he was just so tall and intense, and just, he looked like he could pick up your average Volkswagen and break it in half. You know, just a really intimidating facial expression and carriage and everything. And he'd been through the system a couple of times. This was not his first ever intake. It was just his first time back in a little bit. So he knew what to do. It was, if anything, he was telling me how to ask the questions rather than me just asking them. He was sort of giving ideas. It was cute in its way. And so we go through the questions, and it's exactly, you know, history of prior crimes, history of prior diagnoses, where did you go to school, how far did you go in school, how many people did you grow up with, those sorts of questions. And when we were all done, I, in a fairly, I don't want to say careless or thoughtless, but clueless way, I made eye contact. And I wanted to acknowledge, thank you for giving me your time and for talking with me and for working through this with me. I acknowledge that I asked some hard questions. So thank you. Except what I said And we'll pretend that his name was Joe. We'll pretend that. So what I said to him was, okay, we're all wrapped up. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you, Joe. And Joe looked at me and nobody moved for a second. Like he froze and I froze. And it was as though the air in the room stopped moving. And then he burst into tears. This enormous, intimidating physical specimen, sobbing. And I'm literally holding my head going, oh my God, what did I do? I broke him. How did I do this? What did I do? Oh no, Joe, what did I do? And he's like, I just had forgotten what it was like to hear somebody say my name. Because when you're in prison, the other prisoners refer to you by last name.
Right.
And the guards refer to you by number. I haven't heard another person, my family wrote me off decades ago. And even when I'm in court for things, they call me Mr. So-and-so. So I haven't heard another person just say my first name in a respectful way in probably 10 years.
Jeez.
And I wasn't ready. And I remember I drove home that day and I remember thinking, we are so broken as a society. Because why on earth would Joe have any desire not to reoffend when he doesn't even believe it's possible, when he doesn't believe that he's fundamentally due the basic human decency of acknowledging him by name? Of course he's going to reoffend. Why wouldn't he? He doesn't believe he's capable of that kind of control. And I remember it just broke my heart. And that's when I started asking more open-ended questions. And I also started every intake from that moment on. My first question was, I'd like you to spell your first and last names for me. And then I'd like you to tell me, what would you like me to call you? And if they didn't have an answer, then I went with last name. Because I couldn't do that. You can't break somebody like that and then send them back on the yard when they're all shaken up and upset. You need to be able to front. You need to be able to put that shell back on before you go back. So.
Right. It's funny that you bring that up and tell that story, because I kind of had the impression that that's part of the attraction, that a lot of people feel or believe themselves to be broken and have a tendency to be drawn to other people who are just as broken, if not more so. And I feel like there's something to be said about seeking out those who can understand your individual damage and trauma. And I feel like you were saying, that connection between, I guess, fans would be the best way to put it, and individuals who commit these crimes, I can kind of see it in that sense, that there's a level of respect maybe that neither party gets elsewhere.
See, I would actually, I disagree that there's respect, because the fans are looking for the thrill of it. They're looking to fictionalize and otherize. And the offender is looking for commissary and looking for letters and looking for contact in some way. But they're not actually understanding each other.
Right, fair.
That takes more. It takes harder. And as long as we continue to look at true crime as this sensationalistic, voyeuristic concept, then we keep it all on the big screen and we don't really get to know these people as human beings.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I know that there are no black and white answers, and humans are extremely complex. And I don't know if we're ever going to actually find the answers that we seek, but I think it's worthwhile that we try, and we try to understand, I guess, both sides and understand what makes people do the things that they do. And I also appreciate that you put a focus on recognizing their humanity and that it is necessary to empathize with them. And if there's any hope for rehabilitation, they have to know that they are still human and that they need to hold on to that humanity that still exists.
That they matter.
Exactly. Well, it was pleasant to have this insightful discussion with someone of your experience. I don't want to hold you on for too long, so do you have any final thoughts on the subject?
No, I don't think, like I said, these are my opinions and I can be wrong. You know, there could be a brain abnormality, or it could be too much pornography, or it could be all manner of other things. But I feel like it's easier to label other people and to call names than it is to be vulnerable and genuine. And so let's go ahead and try to do the harder thing.
Right.
Because the easier thing isn't working.
Right. Absolutely. Where can everyone find you?
Mostly in my basement. My show is called Ignorance Was Bliss, and I actually am in my basement, and it's at iwbpodcast.com, and I am on all of the social medias at IWB Podcast, and I'm online far too much. They're welcome to drop me a line on Twitter or Facebook, even Instagram if they're interested. I'll talk to anybody.
Absolutely. I appreciate all of the help that you've already given me. And as a huge fan of your podcast, I'm so glad that we finally got to talk. Those of you who have yet to check out her show, please do. You won't regret it. And I think that's going to be it for now. Kate, I will be sure to put your links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
That was an amazing conversation, and I learned so much more than I expected. Kate gave me quite a few things to think about, and perhaps even changed my perspective a little. I want to preface that while Kate and I both insisted on the importance of recognizing the humanity in these violent individuals, even showing a sense of empathy, I think I can speak for us both when I say neither of us in any way endorses their actions. The victims and their families are who deserve our sympathy. Our point was that, while it's much easier to consider them as monsters, something other than, it's crucial that we remember they were men, women, sometimes even children, who were often damaged and broken in ways we may never understand. The truly frightening thing is that there is often a thin line between monsters and men. We are each capable of both incredible as well as horrendous feats. Keep that in mind while you're on the outside looking in. We all have our demons. So be kind and show compassion to all those you encounter. You never know what battles someone is fighting. To see the world in a way that is different than the way everyone else sees it is pure genius. It is also insanity. Mark Hewitt, Hunted, The Zodiac Murders. Next episode, I'll be bringing you another amazing guest to take a closer look at folklore and superstitions abroad. For now, Assalamu alaikum and namaste. Peace be with you until we meet again. Thanks for listening to me as I've nerded out about stories and beliefs. Join me next week as I journey down the rabbit hole once again by subscribing and listening wherever podcasts are available. Leave me a comment on iTunes. 5-star reviews are always great and help others find the podcast. Also, you can email me at faithandfearpodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, share with others you feel may enjoy or get something out of these conversations. Who knows? Maybe then we'll be one step closer to glimpsing the true nature of faith and fear. Music courtesy of pixabay.com.